walking in front of you. One small oversight, I did not pick up the Wi-Fi code, so my remote isn't going to work. Rather than delay starting and put that in, I'm just going to walk back and forth, and hopefully that won't bother you too much. Thank you for coming. I understand that you all have plenty of things that you could be doing right now, and some of you might be thinking about those very things. I appreciate your time and effort in coming. My name is Beth Ann Knudsen. I am co-founder of the Oriole Mill located in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Give you a little bit of my background. I started out in fine arts and specialized in hand weaving. Of course, didn't we all? And from there, I do not go to sleep on me, not helpful. From there, I went into higher education and taught for a period of time. And in fact, Heather Allen's in the room. She and I worked together at Appalachian Center for Crafts. So it's a small world. You must be very careful. So once again, thank you for coming. And I know all of our hearts go out to Judy and Gary. And I'm just sorry that she's not here and that she's had such a challenging month. Let's hope that she's back for the next one. Very optimistic thought, but let's hope so. Okay, so can you tell me what the topic of today's presentation is?
Jacquard.
Okay. The reason that I asked you to say it is this. You may know that different people pronounce it different ways, right? So you have jacquard, you have jacquard, and for years I've felt really self-conscious about that because in the industry, if you say jacquard, well, blah-de-da, you're going to get some pushback, right? Oh, I failed to mention, I worked in the industry for a number of years doing training and technical support for software that's used to design jacquard woven textiles. But having come from academia, there they call it jacquard, right? Well, it was not long ago we had a visitor, and he brought his French girlfriend with him. And during our conversation, it took me a few moments to realize that when she said jacquard, she was saying what we would recognize as J-A-C-Q-U-A-R-D. And that's when it dawned on me, none of us is saying it right. So it turns out that many things that I was taught or that I read about, I'm just going to say jacquard, because now it's deeply rooted in my brain, jacquard. So forgive me if that feels wrong. So one of the things that I want to talk about today, well, several of the things that I want to talk about today include those things where we, frankly, were ill-informed. One of the things that we've been led to believe, of course, is that the fellow responsible for the jacquard machine, that his name was, can you tell me?
Jacquard.
Joseph Marie Jacquard. Turns out, Jacquard or Jacquard was not his given name, it was a nickname, which I find strangely interesting. And that was his father's nickname as well. So anyway, hopefully there'll be a few juicy tidbits that you'll learn tonight that are unfamiliar to you. Before I start, I want to point out that I brought some props. You know, it's really important that we have things to look at and touch following the talk today. So there's a jacquard woven textile, 2 pieces over here. There's some point paper and painting up here that I'll talk about, and other loom parts. So I'm going to focus primarily on the machine. And I'm just tempted to pick this up, but it's not going to work. And of course, everything I tested today was with that, so we'll see how it goes. Yay! Except that it started one slide too early. There we go. Can anyone identify this image?
Chinese drawloom.
It's a Chinese drawloom. The drawloom was really, well, let's back up. You know, if we're going to go through the history of looms, we'll be here till midnight, and well, I would be here till midnight, and I'm pretty sure the rest of you would be gone. But what we want to talk about is jacquard not only, how do I want to start this? Let me back up a minute. Literally. Let's define jacquard, because everything else we're going to talk about depends on you having some understanding of what that word refers to now. It's a means by which you can control warp threads, theoretically, every warp thread independent of every other warp thread. Now for some of you, you may think, well, I can do that on a backstrap loom. That's right, you can. And the truth is, there's nothing that you can weave on a jacquard loom that you couldn't weave by hand on another loom, given unlimited time and resources, and of course, a really strong back. So really, jacquard developed as a way to speed up the making of very ornate, detailed, large motifs with no repeat across the width. Of course, if you're a dobby weaver or you weave on a standard hand loom, you know that the size of your repeat is based on how fancy your threading is and how many harnesses you have available to you. So when you want to expedite the very ornate weaving, you can do it with a pickup stick, of course, or you could have a draw loom, which, as you can see, requires how many people to weave?
3.
And do they look comfortable? So the way that the draw loom works is that you have a really complex tie-up. So it takes weeks to tie individual warp threads to another device, something like a dowel rod, or it can be another string, and then the draw boy sitting at the very top there has to keep track of which thing to pull up in what order, okay? So the guy on the top is determining what's going to be the next shed. The fellow in between is making sure that this makes a good shed. Everybody know what a shed is?
Yep.
Warp threads open. It's very helpful that hands work as warp and weaving. And then, of course, this fella gets all the credit, but really all he's doing is this, right? They're the ones making it happen. But of course, if that draw boy picks the wrong next shed, you have an error. So there were a number of things that motivated folks to try to design a loom that would be more automated. Number one, they wanted to get rid of the draw boy because he's the cause of errors, and, well, nobody really wants that job for very long. And of course, if you can weave with fewer people, then perhaps you make a little better. So the push to replace the draw boy really came hard and heavy once the draw loom was introduced to Europe, and that was in the 15th century. I'm not a historian, by the way, so I know a few dates, but if you're heavy into that, I won't be a very good resource for you. So the next generation, if you will, is called, I think it's ironic, but they call this a simple loom. This looks simple to you. I think this looks pretty intimidating and complicated. But what they've done is they've eliminated one of those 3 people. You still have to have someone standing here, and that person is pulling what is the next order, and then you, of course, have the person throwing the shuttle and beating the weft into place. And this is a detail of that. So you can see that just the setup time is pretty significant. And it looks like it'd be pretty hard to keep track of what order you want. And it seems like it would be ripe for errors. So the next generation, if you will, was by, and as you already have figured out, I'm not a fluent French speaker, so I'll do my best to pronounce these names, but you might want me to spell them to really be accurate. This is from 1725, and this is from Basile Bouchon. He added a mechanism for selecting the cords to be drawn. Of course, that reduces the opportunity for flaws based on the drawing. He also added a system of perforated paper and needles to an existing loom. And this represented a major improvement. So those of you who are familiar with jacquard, this is already starting to look like a jacquard machine. By the way, we all say jacquard loom, But strictly speaking, that's incorrect, because the jacquard mechanism is the means by which those warp threads are being lifted. And that is set beside or on top of an otherwise ordinary loom. So really, jacquard is the means of the lift, it's not the loom itself. And then that's a detail of it. I do have examples of a more contemporary version of that paper that you're welcome to look at. And if, for those of you who have attention deficit, we can pass this around and you can entertain yourselves with that while. So the next stage in the evolution of the jacquard loom is Falcon's loom. These also have perforated, but these are with boards, heavy-duty boards. So where there's a hole, the assistant actually pushes the board in place. Seems a little crude, but we're getting there in stages. When there's a hole, the hook is pushed back. If there's no hole, then the hook remains in position. A hook corresponds to each needle. I know I'm getting ahead of you here, but it'll make sense as we see the next diagram, I think. The assistant then presses the treadle, the hooks that have moved back then descend, lifting the simple cords from that previous loom that you saw and forming the shed. So all of these things are to try to expedite forming that shed instead of doing this or having the drawboy. And you can see it's a little harder than you might imagine. And you may notice there's not that many holes, which means there's not that many hooks, which means your repeat size is not very big. So, around 1802, 1804, something like that, there was a contest in France to encourage something like encouragement of French industry or something like that, the Society for such. So, that fella was a Lyon-based cloth manufacturer who also invested in research. And this is what he wrote to Jacquard, saying, Wilkinson's loom really has to be part of this exhibition. And so he had a model made, shipped it to Jacquard so that it would be part of this exhibition that was in conjunction with this competition. Wilkinson, at least according to the French writer, or the French published book that I've been reading recently, is considered 18th century's greatest inventor. He introduced a perforated cylinder above the loom and introduced a different approach to the needles and hooks. His cylinder has holes instead of a previous type of cylinder they used that had projections. Anyway, you can think of it a little bit like that previous version, a little bit like a music box. And with the holes in the paper, you can think of that a little bit like a player piano, where there's a hole, something happens. Yes?
About how tall is that machine?
Tall. Like, I would guess 12, 15 feet. Although I'm not very good at those kinds of measurements, but certainly twice my height. So that cylinder was important, but of course a cylinder has a fixed circumference, right? So the pattern had to resolve by the time you got all the way around, so it meant that you were really limited in the height of your pattern. And that's just an easier way to see the parts. So you can see the holes, you might be able to make out the hooks. And that's sorry, I hadn't noticed that it seems like it needs a little more focus. Can you tell me, is that focused now?
Yes.
Okay, so you have hooks that are either caught by what's called a griff. So they're pushed in position, allowed to move into position, and if so, then they get caught on that bar, and then they trigger that warp end being lifted. The hole allows the movement of the pin. That allows the hook to get caught and get raised. And I never like it when people read to me because I figure I can read. So I'm going to let you read that, and I'll take a little sip of water here. Ouch, right? That's kind of harsh. But the reality is that that's probably pretty much more accurate statement than what most of us have been led to believe. So this is the Jacquard installation in Lyon. And I like this particular photograph because I like who's weaving. So of course the first Jacquard looms were indeed hand looms. So what's mechanized is the lift of the warp threads. It's still a human being throwing the shuttle and beating the weft into place. Sorry if I'm blocking your view. So when I read this, I thought, well, just what does that mean? That just seems a little extra snarky. But what it means is this, that up until, I don't remember exact dates, but for a long period of time, in order to be a silk weaver, you first apprenticed for 4 years, and then you were part of a guild for 6 years. So to be a real silk weaver, you had to have already committed 10 years, and that's interesting because that's about what the, oh, I just lost his name, who said 10,000 hours to become an expert. Thank you. Say it louder. Malcolm Gladwell. So, one of the things that we read and we've been told was that there were uprisings in response to Jacquard's machine, right? They rioted in the streets because he was taking their jobs. But from what I've read recently, no such uprisings occurred in response to Jacquard's machine. For one thing, he only sold 41 total, and not all of those were ever even fully in production. In fact, some of those had to be returned because they performed so poorly that the Trade Commission got involved, and a number of the people to whom he had sold those machines, he had to refund their money. They sent back the machines. Not only did he only sell 41 machines, but of course, when the Jacquard machine, you could say, yes, it eliminated the job of the draw boy. But now you have somebody who's got to punch the cards, and somebody who's got to lace them together. So yeah, you've eliminated one job, but now you have additional tasks that need to take place. And the truth is, most people didn't want to be a draw boy. So it's kind of like rebelling against something you don't want to do doesn't really make sense. Okay, so this is my prompt for, I want to show you a little bit of video. But before I get there, let me talk about the revolt that did happen, I think about 3 decades after the time that we're told that that revolt took place. Indeed, there was a revolt, but it was, it started with rents being increased and the economy had declined because of the Paris Revolution of whatever year that was, 1830, something like that. Okay, so what ended up happening is that the weavers needed higher prices from the cloth merchants, and they put in a demand for what they refer to as fair and equitable price for their labors. We can't relate to that at all. So that uprising was really based on, you're not paying me fair price for what I'm producing, not that you're eliminating the job. The other reason that his machine didn't get adopted readily is of course, as we've already established, it didn't work that well. B, it didn't speed up your production. You're still weaving at the same rate, and it was very expensive. So it wasn't quickly adopted because it hadn't proven itself to be worth that investment, the learning curve, as well as the difficulty in making it work. Okay, so what I'd like to do here, let's see if I can do it in an efficient manner. In 2000, I have to think a second. In 2003, I had the opportunity to go to the Netherlands to, how many people here have been to the Textile Museum in Tilburg, in Holland? Fantastic place. They redid the whole thing the year after I was there. I haven't been back, so I don't know how much what I videotaped is still in existence in that way. But I wanted to take you on a tour, a visual tour. I find it very difficult, as you may have already picked up on, to try to describe the mechanism of what's happening with the loom with still photos. So I thought it might be useful to show you video. And what I'm going to do is take you on a short tour through the Tilburg Museum and show you the machine that made the punched paper and how that works. It's not in operation, but for you to see it, and then show you a couple of the looms running. Okay, so we're in the Tilburg in the Netherlands, and what you're seeing right now is the back of what's called a piano punch machine, and it's used on heavier paper than what I have here, but basically you're making holes, and where the holes exist, you're creating your pattern. Can you see the holes from here? Okay. So you can see the paper here. That's quite similar to the punched paper I have. I might have to speed this up a little bit unless you're going to ask me questions. So as we come around, you're going to see that it's actually a pretty sizable piece of equipment. And the reason that it's called, well, you'll see it in a second. Okay, so you can see that it's quite literally a giant punch machine where it's punching holes. They're quite loud, and it's a real technical feat, frankly, to operate one of these, because you are visually reading in a line of pattern, and then you're punching in the cut miss or the lift, not lift, of the pattern as you go. And when I say you're reading in the pattern, you might have something like this.
Wow.
And afterwards, I encourage you to come up and take a look at this. This produced that. So what you're doing when you punch those holes is you're plotting every intersection of warp and weft. And if you think of it as your XY or like battleship, you can imagine that for every intersection of warp and weft, either your warp is up or not. And if warp is not up, then the weft is on top. And in that sense, very simple. On the other hand, punching this in as you go, not so simple. Okay? So you see this pattern is what they are punching. And you can see it's two weaves, one's the reverse of the other. But notice how nice and tight everything matches up. When you're plotting it by hand, every intersection is much more thoughtfully considered. Notice how I thoughtfully considered, saying thoughtfully considered. So here's why it's called a piano punch, because each new technology, of course, is using existing parts. That's pretty much always the way it is. So those piano keys are telling the card puncher odds and evens, right? So that person has to visually read that line and punch it in, one line at a time. So you could argue, how much time is it really saving if you have to do all of this and then all of that? It will make the weaving maybe faster than this, maybe no faster at all if you're doing this. But what it does do is reduce flaws. And that's really important, right? If you're a production facility, you want to be thought of as someone who can reproduce fabric identically each time. Now, most of the people in this room don't necessarily value that, but if your customer says, I reject this because it doesn't match what I bought last season, then suddenly you care about it. Or perhaps you make different choices on who you sell your fabric to. So this is one of the shuttle looms, and I wanted you to have a tour around it before I show you it in operation. So these are the pedals. This is the harness cord. Now, all of you are probably familiar with a huddle, but you probably haven't seen them quite in this configuration. I'm actually holding it upside down. Can you see that there are holes here? Mm-hmm. Okay, so these are huddles. They're actually installed this way. This comes close to the ground and gets mounted to the floor. Here you might be able to make out heavy-duty springs. I always thought it was gravity that brought them back down. No, 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 it's a spring. Here's the huddle. This is the part that attaches to the harness cord. What you're seeing right here are the physical shuttles. So this is a shuttle loom, and the mechanism is a little bit like, well, like whack-a-mole, that game, where it just smacks it across the open shed, and the other side moves into position, catches it, and then that one gets smacked. So that term of box motion that some of you might be familiar with is because that box literally moved up and down on each side of the loom to catch that shuttle. So it's a little bit like Rubik's Cube, because of course you always have to have one empty slot. So if you have 8 openings, you can only run 7 colors. Think about it a little bit, it's like a puzzle. Okay, so that lever on the right is what smacks it. This gear right here is determines how many weft insertions or picks per inch. Because of course, an automated loom, for the most part, runs at the same rate in terms of opening the shed and packing the reed. What changes the density, or how many wefts you can insert per inch, is how fast the warp let off on the back is happening, and therefore how fast the fabric take up on the front is happening. They're working in conjunction. Okay, so now I wanted you to see the variety of cards of the continuous punched paper. And you'll see that they have different generations from the different looms. So when I first started in the industry, still had plenty of customers who were punching paper for their patterns. And what the old timers told me in private, in secret, with no one else listening, and I'm not kidding you, was that the happiest day of their life. And one who was a preacher said to me, don't tell my bride, don't tell my children, but the happiest day of my life, bar none, was the day my mill got rid of the last mechanical looms. Because think about it, you have these little bitty holes, you have paper, okay, little bitty holes, and then you're doing something that creates lint, right? And then you have the machine oils, they get plugged, and guess what? You're back to the draw boy problem, right? You have an error. All of a sudden, you've been running this fabric fine for months. All of a sudden, you have an error. What is the error? Well, then you blame the card cutter, but it's not that person's fault. It's because one of those holes got filled with crud. The other problem with them is storage. If the paper gets too dry and brittle, it doesn't run through properly. If it gets too humid, it sticks together, won't run properly. If it's not all nice and pristine, it doesn't stay in its little holes. And if it gets out of one of those holes, then your alignment's off, the whole thing, right? So don't you kind of feel like we haven't really gotten that much ahead of the draw boy at this point? So now you're seeing, look how many weft insertions that is. That is this accordion folding that you see here, but look how many there are. That's a long pattern. The longer the pattern, of course, the more opportunities for problems within that. And if you get a piece of crud in there, or the paper doesn't function properly, you got to punch that whole thing again. And if you're the guy at the piano machine, of course, when they went electronic, at that point, we eliminated the card cutting job. Which, frankly, is a bit of a shame because those people really understood structure. Because sometimes what they were getting was coded in such a way that they had to interpolate those weave structures as they went. Okay, so he's going to start up this loom for you, And you can see, sometimes it's faster than you believe. Okay? Right? I could turn the sound on, but I thought it would be too loud with the projector noise. Maybe a little sound. Okay, safety alert, he should not be poking his hand in there. He should be using a tool. You never put your hand in the path of that shovel. By the way, anybody who's worked in one of these kinds of mills, you start up one of those machines and they move out of the range of, if that shovel leaves the shuttle race, which at some point it will. Have you walked through one of the old mills, the brick walls, and there's chunks out of the wall? That's the, so they move out of the way, because if that happens to hit you wrong, you are seriously injured. Okay, so now can you make out the threads being lifted by the heddle, attached to the harness, attached to the hook? All the looms, at least to me, have a really compelling, satisfying. I swear there's a few bands who must have had people who worked in mills, because they start up. Next time you're in a mill, if you can just listen to one loom. Well, now I'm really going to date myself. But the song Boogie with Stew by Led Zeppelin starts out, I swear, it's a Jackal thing. Okay, so you can see the box motion, right? It's going up and down to put whatever shuttle color. This is an older loom. I'm sorry about the fidelity. It was 10 years ago. It was the best I could do. So much easier now. But you see how few hooks there are as you go up? And this, you can tell it's an older machine because it's those really heavy, thick cars with the giant holes. Okay? So with each advance, it moves it. Those holes align with the pins. They would only run this for, I think it was 3 minutes, or it might have been less than that, because it was so loud that, you know, in Holland they protect your, well, your hearing a little better than we do here. So, but notice the difference in speed between this one and the previous one? The harness cords are made out of a really strong actual braid. Okay, I'm going to pause. That's okay. So I jumped like 100 years. So now you notice there's no shed opening, because I wanted to show you first how we're inserting our weft. So very intentionally with all the warp threads down, so you could actually physically see the exchange. This is called a rapier. This is called a positive exchange, which means, oh, that he doesn't let go until he's got it firmly. You know, something our Olympic team could learn from, right? So we're going to see it again. And you notice it's putting the weft right on top, because we put all the hooks down, therefore all the warp ends down, so that you could really see what was happening. Now these little sharp fins that come up are what press down. That little lever opens the mouth for one to release and the other one to take. So now we have just a very light shed. So, because if I don't show that, people are like, but it's not weaving. Right. I'm just trying to show it to you. So now, I wanted to try, it's hard to see, I know, but I wanted to try to show you the threads lifting within the heddle eyes. And this, of course, is the reed, greatly magnified. I did bring a couple of little samples of reed. Unfortunately, I didn't have any samples of the really fine reeds that we have that are much more different from the hand weaving reeds than what I have here. So we're doing it in slow motion with the hope that you can you make out the heddles? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so every time a heddle is lifted, it's because the corresponding hook has been lifted in the head. And originally, those hooks really were physical hooks. I think I have it correct. So, quite literally a hook. Now, they're not quite like that. They're now, well, at least in the Stabile machines, this is called a module. And that's what controls 16 hooks. They're always in banks of 16. So Jacquard weavers, without knowing it, learn 16-bit systems, right? We have 1344, 2688. For years, I'm like, oh, these numbers are so strange and arbitrary. They're all multiples of 16. Oh, I just had to put this in because I thought you might want to see a weaver's knot. Now, I have a BFA and an MFA in fiber and textiles. No one ever taught me a weaver's knot. So I thought you might get a kick out of seeing it. So he did it in slow motion. He's a good teacher. And I think he could learn how to do it from this little video. See how he tucks it underneath there? You got it? I was taught to just do an overhand knot, right? But on our machines, that big old hunky knot will not go through the reed. And it's just going to break it every time you try. So the weaver's knot, if it's done properly, is really strong. If you don't do it exactly right, it falls out. It comes apart. Okay, any questions on what I just showed you? Okay. See if it's going to let me do it. Okay, so you've already seen a little bit of the, I should have had this slide before I moved to the movies, but oh well. I wanted you to see some still photos from the Textile Museum as well. So these are hand looms. They weren't being used when I was there, but I thought it was a pretty clear illustration of the harness cords. Here's your Jacquard mechanism. Off to the side are the cards, and I have another view where you'll be able to see them. So now you can see the whole machine. This is the back of the loom. You can see the cards here. And you can see the Jacquard mechanism up above. This is where the weaver sits, obviously. And note the leather there to keep the weaver from soiling the linen. And then this is just a really clear illustration of the cards. So one of the things that was interesting to me reading recently is that no patent for that Jacquard loom that he took credit for, no patent was ever filed on that particular machine. He did win the contest, that competition that I mentioned to you earlier, for a machine that he designed that was to make fishing nets. However, it didn't function very well. One writer said that fabric, the knots moved, allowing the fish to escape. So, not very successful. Harsh. It's a little upsetting, frankly, to have your profession, to discover that everything you've been taught and read is not accurate. So this is what I was referring to earlier. Indeed, it was not related to the loss of those, because of course all the other skills were still needed, and it added additional tasks, so there really wasn't a loss of employment. And from what I read, he canceled the patent on that fishnet machine in 1804. Okay, so one of the things that I want to talk about in terms of Jacquard, outside of how the machines evolved, is how they're set up these days, okay? So up above here, this is actually two heads. You know, two heads are better than one. Monoblock is a little easier, but because we were purchasing only from the used market, it's a lot easier to get the smaller heads. So these two heads are each 3072 hooks for a total of 6144 capacity. In this particular case, I want you to notice that there's these crossing lines. This is harness cord that I'll be happy to pass around, and that's what you're looking at there. So the reason that you have these crossings is that in this case you have what I refer to as a harnessed repeat of 4. Of course, I can make in my motif as many repeats as I want, but in this case, anything I do in one place, I will do 4 times, right? So you can think of it a little bit like a row of marionette puppets, right? I could have one cord for each right arm, or I could have all the right arms connect to one cord. So I pull that one and all right arms raise. So this is that way. Now typically we design in such a way that you're not visually aware of those separate repeats. The idea is to give it that uniform overall look. In this case, that's part of the design of the fabric and helps me illustrate it. So this has 4,800 hooks installed in the head, but because each hook is used 4 times, controlling equidistant across the way, a 29.375 inch repeat here, we have 19,200 warp threads, controlled by 4,800 hooks. Got it? That's the marionette puppets.
So it's 4,800 hooks total in both heads, like a combination?
Yeah, because we bought this used and we chose not to fill out, because we could have purchased additional modules and filled it out. But if you do that, then you also have to add harness cords, right? And harness cords run, about $1.50 each. So if you're thinking of going larger than 19,200, that's a commitment. And you should really be sure, because it means that any product you previously wove won't be able to weave on that machine now. And that machine's going to be down for a period of time where, hello, it's not, paying for itself. So it's kind of a big deal.
How many machines do you all currently have?
Well, we just acquired some, so I'll have to think. We're close to 12 Jacquard machines. Not all are up and running, but we're close to 12. And then we have 2 high-speed Dobby, industrial Dobby machines. Okay, so this is actually the front of the loom, but you're not seeing the area where we would stand and see the fell of the cloth. This is what's called an off-loom take-up. So from the fell of the cloth to here is 9.5 yards. And that allows us to inspect the fabric as we're weaving. So this is actually a light box, so you can see any issues before you've woven 1,000 yards of it. Okay, so this is another coupled set of heads. And you can see here that we also have a repeat, but here we have a repeat of 2. So here we have 2 30-inch repeats for a total weaving width of 60 inches. This is set at 101 ends per inch. That previous loom, this one, is 163 ends per inch. And then this next one, you can see once again, it's coupled heads, but you see they're not crossing. Well, what's up with that? Well, in this case, sorry, that very last loom, I misspoke. It's 195 ends per inch of the one that just has the 2 crossing. This is 1 hook, 1 warp end. Ooh, that's what we all want, right? Because that means there's no limitation. In other words, what I do here does not necessarily get replicated here unless I want it to. So it means that if I want to weave a giant circle, width to width, I can do that. So this, this is just pure joy. So this has 6,096 hooks for the body cloth at 101 ends per inch. And for those of you who care, it's a 32 long staple Egyptian Giza cotton that's been mercerized and cast. Okay, so now I thought it might be interesting to you, but to see more of the innards. Because typically when you go into a mill, everything's up and running, and you don't get to see, like, well, what does it look like before the harness is installed? Let me see the parts and how they go together, and maybe I can better understand the whole thing. So if you're standing under one of these heads, like that, and there's no harness installed, your view is going to be like this. So these little white things are little white hooks that are dangling there, waiting for that part that got sent around, where at one end it's got some black plastic. These get attached and then they get sealed over that. And then this is just a detail. So this is the other end of this. So at the top of this you have a seal card. At the bottom, see those? That's what you're looking at from below, but many of them. And of course, ribbon cable. Plenty of us are old enough to remember when that was a common thing in our lives, like floppy drives. Heck, I'm old enough to remember phonograph records and all sorts of things. Okay, so this is me standing up on that gantry, which is, so I don't know, 15 feet off the ground, 20 feet off the ground, 15 feet off the ground. And there are openings on the side that I can look in. So this is the bottom of those hooks, and you see that orange harness cord gets attached to these.
How long are the harness cords, like 150,000 yards, or, I mean, you know, in terms of?
Well, they're different lengths, you notice, because all of the heddles have to be exactly the same height to get a good shed. But if it's going from there to there versus from here to here, it's a different length. So a lot of math and highly skilled. But I don't know, if I had to guess, I'd say maybe 15 feet as they make that diagonal. But I don't actually know that off the bat. Nobody's ever asked me that one before. So this is what's called the Comer board, the most heavy-duty plastic you'll ever see in your life. And when we redo things and we have some of that left over, we make stuff out of it because it is indestructible. So like flatbed trolleys and that sort of thing. And of course, it never gets dirty because the dirt just falls through. So here's a close-up of that attachment of the harness cord to the hook. Actually, it's to the clip. That's not really the hook. And then another close-up of those going through. Now, on this one, you can't quite see it. Say that again?
Do you only have to tie this in once?
Yes. But it takes, jacquard machines are one of those places where there's still a lot of tasks that can only be done by humans. So the making of the harness is done by humans, the installation of the harness is done by humans, and it takes more than a week. And you can imagine you're standing up in there and your hands are above your head for 8 hours a day. And it's not possible, I believe, it's not possible to hook all of those up without an error. So in addition to the time it takes for setting up, you then have to allow some weeks for testing, because some misplaced cords, some of those mistakes don't show up in every pattern. But what I've found is the best test is a 5N satin. Remember, we're based on 16 and all of that, so that tends to flush them out. But you have to allow weeks of weaving to find the errors. Sad but true. So you notice here, just one cord per hole. But if this was a harnessed repeat, you would see 2, or in our case, 2 or 4. And then that's just a close-up showing you the crossing of those cords. And the crossing of the cords is because hooks are located in different positions, and when you get to the heddle, they have to be the same height.
So I take it when those are set up, they're set up not permanently, but almost permanently?
Pretty much permanently.
And then that's when you basically have a need for a new pattern, then you, and it does mean you go get a new machine that gets set up a certain way, so you don't have to move your machines around in terms of how the harnesses are set up.
Pretty much once a harness is set up, you don't change it. Because of the cost, and because of the downtime, and because unless you're going to render it completely obsolete, all of what was previously produced on that machine. So this is the innard. So this is where you saw. This is a head that where the case is opened and it's not set up yet. So things are kind of splayed in a way that makes it easier for me to show you. So what these are the ends of these. And then that's what it looks like when you look in the head. So you might be able to make out that's the top of the seal card with the ribbon. And then I'm going to quickly go through these. Thought you might want to see how the weft works outside of just that rapier exchange that you saw. So the weft is coming from accumulators here. Behind that is a creel that has full packages of yarn. The accumulator, if you were here in the beginning where you saw things happening, it's wrapping yarn around this expandable diameter, and it's wrapping enough to do a full insertion with no hiccup. You know, if you're pulling off of a package, and it's gonna break or have problems. But if you're pulling from something that can give you continuous, then you have fewer issues. This is a close-up of the needles that drop. That needle drops, that weft is then in the path of the rapier catches it, moves to the center where it passes on to the other rapier. These are the needles that drops it in the path of this, which grabs it, carries it to the center. This is a sensor, so if a weft thread breaks or runs out, the loom shuts off. So as it's running, you'll see little green lights going here, letting the operator know that it's functioning properly. These are the accumulators from which the weft comes through from the creel on the right, through the accumulator, and then into the shed.
Are these fairly indestructible?
They're hardy, but if you hit the wrong button at the wrong time, you can do a lot of damage to the loom and to any humans in the area. So if you weave at the wrong density, meaning that the warp let off and the fabric take up are not going fast enough for the number of wefts and the size of the weft that you're inserting, what can happen is called a smash, where, okay, normally as the reed beats, the fell of the cloth stays in the same place, right? And that's because that fabric that's already being woven is moving out of the way. But if it's not moving out of the way fast enough, what happens is that when that reed hits, if the fell of the cloth should be here, but because it's not moving out of the way fast enough, it's actually buckling in front of that. You can hear it. It sounds like a sail whipping in the wind. And when you hear that noise, you need to shut that puppy down because it's about to cause a smash. And a smash is when the rapier cuts out the warp, which means that it's no longer in the proper path of the, what we used to call a shuttle race, but the proper path, and it's going to destroy the reed and probably destroy the rapier. And when it does that, if there's anyone in proximity, they're at serious risk of being injured. That's the back of the loom. And
Sorry, who determines that rate? Is that something a designer?
actually, there's a lot of testing. So, I mean, you have to have some idea to start, right? But one of the things that, frankly, it's true of all weaving, but somehow it doesn't seem to get communicated in that way, at least in my experience in hand weaving, and that's the aspect ratio. In other words, most of the time, I am not inserting the same number of wefts per inch as I have warp ends per inch. So just like a knit stitch is not a true square, and if you design on true square graph paper, well, Santa's going to be really distorted in your sweater, right? So it's the same idea here. Another way to think of it is, you know, films that were shot for a wide screen, if you then show them on TV, they either have to squish them or letterbox them because they were shot for a different ratio of width to height. So one of the things that when we teach, we talk about is this. So you can see, it's just a little study. Okay, so what you want is determined with this particular warp density and this particular weft size yarn and this particular set of weave structures, at what point do I get a true circle? Okay, that's the point at which I know, okay, that's my magic spot for design. And of course you want to do your test well, you want to take the fabric that you did your test on through whatever stages, if it's going to get washed or whatever, because you need to design for the final fabric, not frankly what's on the computer. And that sometimes is tough. But this is what determines it. So after you've done enough testing, okay, if I'm using a 5N satin with a 22 weft, then I can weave on at 101 ends per inch, I can weave at 35 picks per inch. I think I'm out of time. Am I? I know we started late, but I have one more thing to show you. Okay. So, in case you want to see the stages of making a fabric, or sometimes what I refer to as the stages of making a loom file. So, what I'm going to show you is the stages of what produced this particular piece. Okay? So, one of the things that I really enjoy about jacquard is that you can take very small scale and make it giant. So the original watercolor drawing for this was 4 by 6 inches. Oh, no, I don't know where to put it. It's okay. Let's put it right here. Thank you. Okay, so that started out as a watercolor drawing. So I'm going to show you the watercolor drawing. Okay? So, of course, lots of color. And, it's very easy for people to get so focused on the color that they're in love with in the original image that they want all that color in the woven fabric. But remember, in a woven fabric, unless you have a color rotation and a color effect weave, in order to have a color, you have to have a separate insertion. And to have many colors means that your fabric is going to weave really slowly, hard on the loom, and be really thick. If I want 4 colors at a time, then I'm inserting 4, but they're not stacking like that in the cloth. They have to slide and hide, and they stack like this. So at any given point in that visual line, it's one of those 4 colors, right? So my preference is to try to exploit what the jacquard weaving process does naturally. So I like to focus on yarn and structure more than color, which is convenient. Frankly, if I really wanted this in fabric with all that color, I'd do a digital print. As far as, from my perspective, weaving is a transformative process. I don't necessarily want an exact duplicate of the original. I want something that gives me juicy, good source to build the fabric from. So the first thing that I did was to drop it to grayscale, right? Because I'm going to do shading satins in this case. So here, wherever I have my darkest value, that will be the most weft dominant in the satin, and where it's the lightest, it'll be the most warp dominant, because this particular loom was set up with an unbleached warp. This was woven in Tilburg. I do have footage of it, but we don't have time. Okay, so when the weaves are assigned and cut in, it looks disastrous. But remember, we're plotting holes, or the electronic equivalent of those holes. So everywhere there's an intersection, warp and weft, which is throughout, of course. You have to plot for everywhere. It's not like paper where you can leave places blank. Everywhere where I need a warp lifted, it gets a black square, just like at least the way we did hand drafting for weaving. We filled in a black square where we wanted that harness raised. So what you end up with looks a little crazy, but if I were to invert that, it would look very similar to the woven fabric. In other words, if I was designing on a black warp with a white weft, my design in terms of that, with the weaves cut into it, would look similar to my fabric now. Here it's reversed because of that. And that's all I have for you today. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, so feel free. No one has any questions?
No, but I have a comment.